Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to Building a Better World with Words in partnership with Five Leaves Bookshop. My name is Sandeep Mahal, and I have the thrilling role of heading up Nottingham's prestigious UNESCO City of Literature designation. I suspect all of you know that Nottingham is famously known for the legend of Robin Hood, a city that champions social justice, that looks out onto the world, engages with the global community, promotes openness and a great welcome. As an international creative city, that welcome is really important to us. We share the UNESCO designation with only 38 other cities across the world, the likes of Durban, Dunedin, Lviv, Prague, Iowa City, and Lahore. The Cities of Literature Network has emerged as a powerful force advocating the importance of literature as a catalyst for building bridges, for bringing about community cohesion, and for fostering greater empathy and understanding. And it is with the help of these vibrant international partnerships that we remain resilient in a changing world. And so to tonight, I am absolutely delighted to have three wonderful guest authors whose books have changed the way I look at the world and my understanding of history. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I hope you will all join in too. So please do jump into the chat room and let us know who you are and where you are listening in from. If you have a question for any of our guests, post your question in the Q&A room that you can see along the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick up those questions during the Q&A session later on. We're really excited to be partnering with Five Leaves Bookshop, and we have Ross in the chat room who can answer any book-related questions, and do make the most of their exclusive 3 for 2 offer on all books by our guest authors. So now I'm very excited to introduce our host for this evening, Keith Kahn-Harris. Over to Keith to introduce our first guest, well, both our guests, and explain how this event is going to work. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Hi, I'm Keith Kahn-Harris, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this event. We have two authors here today. We have Philippe Sands, who is a professor of law at Queen Mary University, author of the books East West Street, and most recently this book, The Ratline. And he's also a practicing barrister. And we also have Stephan Collishaw, who's author of novelist, author of a number of books, including this one, The Song of the Stork, and also runs a publisher called Noir Press that publishes contemporary Lithuanian, actually I don't think it's just contemporary, but Lithuanian fiction in translation. Now these are two very different authors, but what I hope to do this evening is to get them talking to each other and to focus on what I thought were some very striking similarities in their work. And we're going to talk for about 45 minutes before handing over to questions. So welcome, Philippe and Stephan.
Good evening. Hello, great to be here.
The first thing, the first I thought quite striking similarity between both of you is that you're both people who come from this country, but part of you is often in another place that draws your fascination and your passion and your interest. One, in Stephan's case, that's Lithuania, and in Philippe's case, that is the city of what is now called Lviv, has been called Lvov, has been called Lemberg, and is now in Ukraine. So the first thing I want to ask both of you is, how is it that, what was the journey that led you to finding this other place that has become such a source of passion and interest in your work? Philippe, should we go first? Just and if you could answer that, and then I'll turn to Stephan.
Sure. Well, just to say, it's incredibly nice to be in this program with the three of you, with the two of you, and to be connected to Nottingham in this way. City I know pretty well. When I was a kid, I used to go and watch Arsenal games in Nottingham. Great days of football, an incredible team run by an extraordinary manager. And so I'm forever associating the city with that part of my childhood. One of the things I didn't know in my childhood was the story of my grandfather, who lived until I was 37 years old. His name was Leon Buchholz, and he never talked about the war or what happened before the war. And in my 50th year, I got an invitation to give a lecture in this city, Keith, that you mentioned, Lviv, on the cases that I do, the work that I do on these two international crimes: genocide, the killing of groups, and crimes against humanity, the killing of individuals on a large scale. And I accepted, not because I really wanted to give a lecture, but because I wanted to visit the city, which I had worked out was the place my grandfather was born in when it was called Lemberg. And that was really how this whole thing started. It was about identity. I wanted to know who my grandfather was. And in knowing who my grandfather was, it was a way of getting to know better who I was, aspects that had been never talked about in the family. And I went and discovered amazing things about the city, that it was the origins of the two crimes that I'd been working on for nearly 30 years and was not aware of. I was not aware of that fact. And there were other remarkable people who came. So in essence, it's that, and maybe Stephan has a similar experience, I don't know, that you come to a point in your life where you've done a lot of the things that you want to do, and you start asking yourself questions about origins and identity and memory and silence. And that was how this project about East-West Street and the Ratline began.
So Stephan, is it a similar story for you?
Well, I don't have the privilege of Philippe's personal history. I mean, I have absolutely no historical connection to Lithuania at all. I'm a Nottingham boy, born and brought up in a Nottingham council estate. And it was very much, when I was in my mid-20s, I was kind of looking for direction about where I was going to go to. And I had qualified as a teacher and hated it. And I decided to go back into academia and was about to start an MPhil in Elizabethan working class fiction. And before I started it, the summer before I started it, I went with a couple of friends, and we went in a minibus, and we traveled around Eastern Europe from Warsaw down to Tirana. And this was in 1995, the summer of 1995. And I'd never been to Eastern Europe before, and there was something about the place that I found absolutely incredible. And bizarrely, what I found particularly fascinating was the kind of the Soviet aspects of the Eastern Europe, which is probably the ugliest part of Eastern Europe that you could possibly think of. And I particularly remember being in Poland and being on one of these monumental housing estates, where it was literally 9-story block, 100 meters of gravel, 9-story block, and off into the distance. And it was brutal. And there was something really fascinating for me about it. My friend kept saying to me, look, my friend had a flat in Vilnius, which he wasn't using, and he wanted somebody to live there. And he kept saying to me, come and live in Vilnius. I was going, no, I've got this MPhil to do. I'm all set up. And then the last day I was in this dirty little cafe in Poland, and something just like switched in my head, like, just do it. And so I said to him, yeah, fine. And I thought I'd wake up the next day with huge regrets about having said that to him. But I kind of never felt the regret. I went back to England. I put my MPhil on hold and got onto a bus, and in September 1995, I arrived in Vilnius, which I knew absolutely nothing about. I knew nothing about Vilnius. I knew nothing about Lithuania. I knew nothing at all. And it was not a good time to go to Vilnius, I have to say, in terms of the city as it was then. Lithuania had been independent for, I think, about 4 years at that point in time. And I think any of the kind of euphoria of the independence had kind of worn off in the hard reality of the collapsed state that it was at that point in time. In fact, 2 of the banks collapsed when I was there, almost bringing the government down with them at that point in time. But for me, it was just, I literally fell in love with the city, and walking around the streets of the city and trying to find the identity of this city. It was like falling in love, and I think I've never lost that feeling. Though the city has changed tremendously over the last 25 years, it's no longer the city that it was.
So I wasn't planning to ask about this, but I'm wondering whether there's a generational thing here, because I'm 48 years old, and in 1995 I also went to Vilnius, and Latvia, and also travel around Estonia. And I had a very strong sense, that was just after I left university, so it looks like Stephan and I are a similar age, that this world that was closed to me had opened up. Philippe, was there a sense of that with you? I mean, I think I certainly grew up not thinking I would ever be able to visit a place like Lviv or Vilnius or wherever it was. And maybe it was just it was a place that was out of mind in a way, not a
No,
I
mean, what Stephan says and what you're saying really resonates with me. I mean, you can have a love affair with a place. And I walk around the streets of Lviv, which has a very dark history, as Vilnius does. But smelling the history and the personal stories and the struggles and the fights between groups. But the bottom line of it is, I absolutely love the place. And what you've been saying, Stephan, absolutely resonates with me. I'm about 10 years older than you guys. And so I started in the mid-80s when it was still under Soviet rule. So I went in 1986 to the Soviet Union for the first time to visit a friend of mine who was doing his PhD. We were friends from uni, and he'd gone off to live in Moscow and was studying at MGU, Moscow State University. 86, okay, so this is, you know, I think Brezhnev was still around. It's really heavy stuff. I loved it. I loved the secrecy of it. I loved the fact that we were being followed. I loved the food. I loved the darkness. There was something incredibly romantic about it. I loved the fact that when I had to talk my way past the guard at the university, and I showed him my London Underground weekly pass, he took that, as though this was a really sort of authoritative British document. And I just loved everything about it. And there is a romanticization of these places that continues to this day.
So there are all sorts of issues with romanticization, just as there can be some issues with love affairs, that the fantasy behind a lover can or cannot relate to the actuality. So I'm wondering, both of you have written about extremely dark pasts in these places. Is the love that you have for them and the desire to write about them, is it about reclaiming them from that dark past, or is the darkness part of the whole package and inseparable from it? Stephan?
I have to say, I feel slightly conflicted about this, and certainly in terms of my writing journey, my writing history. Though I had written before I went to Vilnius, it was very much, when you walked around Vilnius in the mid-1990s, the whole central part of the city in the old town was very derelict. And I'd walk down these narrow streets, a street called Stiklu, which is the glassmaker's street, or Zhidov street, or Jewish street, or Antolsko street. And you walk down this street, and most of the buildings are uninhabited and collapsed. And there was one particular street that I walked down, which was called, I used to walk down there quite a lot, it was called Sventi Stefano Street, St. Stephen Street. So obviously it was a favourite of mine, and particularly derelict and grimy part of the town near the station. And there's one particular building that the walls had crumbled, and if you walked over into the centre of the building, you could see the Jewish writing around there, around the wall, the Yiddish there. And it seemed to me as though there were two towns. There was the town that was, and then there was this kind of ghost town. There was a town of, Philippe talked about the fact that in terms of the memory, it's almost as though the people hadn't gone, as though there was a resonance still within the place of something that had been before. And for me, it was very much a journey of trying to understand in the first case what had happened in Vilnius, why there was this huge space in the center of what I found later was the center of the ghetto area, why that space was, what the stories had led there. But then for me, it became very much an exploration of how could it happen? How, on a human level, and my first novel, The Last Girl, was very much looking from a human level. How could ordinary people engage in the terrible things that happened? How would I respond as an ordinary person in these extraordinary dark times? And I think possibly one of the attractions to towns like this or places like this is the sense that you have to grapple with hugely complex and challenging moral situations, that there is a kind of a depth that you have to mine in order to understand a place.
Philippe?
I mean, that again, I mean, we're walking similar streets, Stephan, but in a slightly different perspective. So I'm walking the streets of my grandfather's family, and what I have in my mind as I'm walking down, say, Abbot Hoffman Street, one of my favorite streets in Lviv, where the great writer Joseph Roth lived, and Joseph Vitlin lived, and Stefan Zweig visited Roth there. So the imagination opens up, but it's also a very dark place, because my grandfather left the city in 1914 when the Russians actually invaded, and went with his mum and his two sisters to Vienna. So that was where really he grew up from 10 years of age onwards. But he left behind a very large family, more than 80 people, all of whom were killed between 1941 and 1944. And so he was the only survivor from that family. So I'm walking down this street with that memory and that imagination. How would I have been if I had been them, if I had been targeted? But I've put myself in a different position, because the Ratline, for example, is about the man who killed my grandfather's entire family, a man called Otto Wächter, who was the governor of Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov, and whose son I have come to know and befriended, to be frank. We get on. But he has a sort of starry-eyed view of his dad. And when I'm engaged in these complex conversations with Horst Wächter about his father, in which he's in a sort of denial about what his dad got up to, I go through what Stephan has exactly just described. How would I be if my dad murdered 1 million people? Would I love my dad? Would I hate my dad? And I'd never asked myself those stories until I went to these places. And so what this place enabled me to do was to shift my perspective and put myself in the position of the person asking the kind of questions that Stephan is asking. What would I have done in that position? And I have to put my hand on my heart and say, I hope I would do the right thing. But of course, I don't know what I would actually do when push comes to shove. And that, I think, is the only honest answer one can give. We just don't know what we would do to save ourselves in those circumstances.
So those are questions that are very difficult to answer. And that leads on to the topic of silence. What happens when there is an unanswered question that is so big, or an issue that is so big that it cannot be talked of? And this is another striking similarity to both of your work, despite both of you work in very different genres. In Stephan Collishaw's book, The Song of the Stork, one of the main characters is mute. We never find out why he's mute. He's not deaf, but he is mute. And there's a kind of sense that that's metaphorical. I don't think it's just a metaphor, but I think there's a metaphorical element of it. And Philippe, you're talking about Horst Wächter, who is not silent in the sense of being, he doesn't talk. He clearly talks a great deal, but has certain areas that cannot be spoken of. Is your work, particularly as outsiders coming into these spaces, is your job partly to break those silence and to encourage others to break them too? Either of you can take that first.
Stephan, you should. I've just spoken. Stephan, you should hear.
Well, I'm actually very interested in what you have to say about that, actually, because in terms of being in conversation with somebody who is emotionally entangled in the whole affair, in terms of talking to the son of somebody who's responsible for the murders of your family. I'm sorry that I haven't read Ratlines yet, but were you able to broach with him the nature of that guilt? Did you feel that you could have those conversations? Was he willing to have those?
Yeah, no, I could speak about those things very openly, because Horst Wächter, the son of Otto Wächter, accepts that terrible things have happened, accepts that millions of people were murdered, Jews, Poles, Roma, gays, lots of other people, and that his father was involved in that. What he doesn't accept, and this is the point of difference between us, is that his father was complicit in some criminal way. And that is the struggle that he has for him. But what the journey that I've been engaged in on the last 10 years has done has actually forced me to deal with my own country. You know, we're living right now through the Black Lives Matter situation. I've been following a little bit what's going on in Nottingham and reviews about street names and things like that. And are there any statues or other things up that the city would want to have a think about? How do we engage with our own past? And I just wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books on a case that I've been involved in concerning the removal of the Chagosian community from islands that were part of Mauritius, the Chagos case. Black people who were thrown out forcibly by the United Kingdom, and realized that at the very time they were being thrown out in the late 60s and early 70s and mid 70s, I was at school learning about Britain's glorious empire and greatness of Britain, but no one ever talked to me about racism, colonialism and slavery. And I often find myself in Austria and Germany talking about books that I've written about their countries with a sort of sense of embarrassment, because the one country that has singularly failed to engage with its past in any way at all, in a real sense, I think still, is the United Kingdom. Unlike Germany, which has really engaged with this terrible period, and Austria, which has, I think, partly engaged with that terrible period, I know from my trips to Lithuania, there isn't really an engagement, you know, with the role of Lithuanians, just as in the Ukraine. No one in Lviv really wants to own up to the fact that it was the Ukrainians who were the willing foot soldiers to the Germans. There were very few Germans there. A lot of the dirty work was done by Ukrainians. And these silences, I think, in the cities we visit, force us to be honest about our own silences and to say, as I do very upfront, look, what is my right to lecture you in Germany or Austria or Ukraine about your bloody past when I haven't in my own country engaged with those issues. And so this journey has caused me to look much more closely at my own national situation.
So I want to go back to the UK case in just a second before, Stephan wants to jump in.
Well, I was just wondering if I could take kind of a looping kind of response to what Philippe was saying in terms of taking it back to England, but first taking it back to Lithuania. And Philippe, I absolutely understand what you're saying here. I mean, in terms of the Song of the Stork, there is a lot about muteness. It's a novel about a young girl finding her voice, but it's also about people's histories being written out. It's about people silencing other people not allowing other people's stories to be told or to even exist. And it was something that struck me really incredibly deeply in Lithuania. When back in 1995, 1996, I took my two stepdaughters to a beautiful open-air ethnographic museum near Kaunas in Lithuania. It's a really idyllic place, and it's set out on various different hills. There's meadowland. They've constructed these kind of regional homesteads that you kind of wander around. And then as you get into the middle of it, there's a little old town, and it's got a kind of a baker shop and a pottery shop and a church, etc. And you kind of get to see ancient Lithuania. And I have to say, it's kind of this beautifully idyllic place. And I've got some photos of my kids from then, and it's like one of those beautiful memories. And it wasn't until a lot later that I had actually started to ask the questions and say, in that recreation of Lithuania, in that ethnographic history of Lithuania, when I went into the little town, where was the tailor shop? Where was the synagogue? Where were the Jewish homesteads? And shockingly, for me, what I see is this rewriting of history. So in a place like Lithuania, not only do you get a country where they actually murder 95% of their Jewish population, one of the most wonderful, rich Jewish populations in the world as it was at that point in time, not only do they wipe them out, but then they erase them from their history as though they never existed. It's a false picture of what Lithuania would have looked like 100 years ago. Lithuania didn't look like this ethnographic this ethnographic museum 100 years ago. Lithuania was a very multicultural place 100 years ago. In many towns, many shtetls in Lithuania, there would have been a majority Jewish, a majority Yiddish-speaking people in that small Lithuanian town. That's what Lithuania was like 100 years ago. But if you look at these history books and if you look at these ethnographic museums, it's as though they didn't exist. And sorry, you've got to put it in. But my point here is that obviously the way in which we tell histories is really, really important. And the way I was bringing this back to what Philippe was saying was that, obviously Lithuania to an extent is tackling it. Philippe is absolutely right to say that they're not seriously tackling it, but there is a sense in which they're arguing about it, denying it, and having this argument about it. But there is some form of engagement with the issue. Whereas I think when you come back to England, I think there is only over this last year beginning to be some kind of realistic engagement with the silences in our past, with the missing histories in our past, with the things that have been erased or the things that have been glorified that shouldn't have been glorified. And I don't think we've had those conversations at all. And I think, I agree with Philippe. 10 years ago, I was quite happy to go to Lithuania and say, why can your ethnographic museum not have a Yiddish section to it? Why is there no synagogue? I could happily go and do that 10 years ago. Now, I feel like Philippe, the sense of embarrassment in terms of the fact that there is so much that we in England have to do in terms of actually reassessing our own histories and looking at them. And I think that's incredibly important we do that.
I mean, do you think that this is a question for both of you, due to this, there's a kind of oddness in how the empire fell. The British Empire, Britain divested its empire in the years following this definitive victory, or what is considered to be a definitive victory. So you have this failure and victory all wrapped up together in a very, very peculiar sort of package. Whereas places like Lithuania or Ukraine are places of suffering. They're places where suffering is a very recent memory in a way that isn't perhaps the case within Britain. And perhaps that suffering, do you think that suffering perhaps provides the basis for breaking that silence in a way that may be more difficult in the UK?
I mean, this theme was put to me in a different way, and is often put to me in a different way in Lviv and in other parts of Ukraine, where people will say to me, you have to understand, Philippe, we only became a truly independent country in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And you can't expect a new country that is struggling to define itself and establish its identity on a global stage to immediately come to terms with its past of 70, 80 years ago. And I think there is truth to that. I really do understand that. It is going to take time for Lithuania, for Ukraine, for other countries as they nation build and create their sense of identity today in this difficult and modern world. And of course, the United Kingdom doesn't have that, but the United Kingdom has something else right now, which is as these countries are going in one trajectory, the UK seems to be going in another. I mean, I think we are witnessing historically the breakup of the United Kingdom. I think Northern Ireland will be gone very soon. I think Scotland will follow. And that will leave a United Kingdom of England and Wales. The Welsh will decide what they want to do in that circumstance. And that is the logical conclusion, ironically, of what was imposed on United Kingdom in 1945 by President Roosevelt, who made it a condition of the post-war settlement, which included the division with the Soviet Union, that the United Kingdom relinquish its empire, that decolonization began. And that's what began in June. We've just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter. And in the Charter, you will find a treaty-based commitment to decolonize and give states their independence. And that is something the United Kingdom is struggling to come to terms with still today, which is the great irony of our esteemed Prime Minister sort of seizing the mantle of FDR in the past days without fully realizing that it was FDR who drove this cart forward as a way of ending the empire. That was the deal in 1945.
Do you think that if this situation comes about and a post-Brexit Britain breaks up, do you think that England would be like Ukraine or Lithuania and being a place that sees itself as a young country defining its place in the world? Or, because my suspicion is it would see itself as actually as a continuity, as an old country, rather than something explicitly new, with all the problems that comes with that?
I mean, it's been interesting watching Lithuania over the last 30 years in terms of my connection with it. And Lithuania is both a new country and a very ancient country. And I think what it really underlines is how important history is in terms of determining our concept of who we are. And I think, you know, that's every bit the same for an individual, us, our own histories, what has made us who we are. And it's the same on a national level. How do we define ourselves? What's the important steps that took us to being who we have become? Taking the randomness of our histories and trying to weave something coherent from them in order to get a sense of who we are at this moment in time. Lithuania has really struggled because in terms of its narrative of itself, the once great nation, Lithuania was this once fantastically great nation that stretched from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea, as it often likes to remember, had a brief period again of independence between the two wars, and then suffered from 45, 50 years of oppression from the Soviet Union. Its narrative of itself is of its grand past, its sense of its own authenticity in terms of its language and the conservation of its language. And in terms of its narrative of itself and its fight against the Soviet Union, it was very important for them to celebrate their partisan war that fought against the great heroes of the Lithuanian nation who fought against the Soviet Union from the forest. The forest wars, the struggle in Lithuania against the Soviet Union lasted right through to the mid-1950s. So that there were partisans fighting in the forests of Lithuania all the way up until about 1954, 55, when they were finally crushed. And the Lithuanian partisans, became the heroes of the modern day Lithuania, because they formed part of the narrative about Lithuania has never given in to the oppressor. We always have strived and struggled for our freedom. Now, the complexity of this is, and this is what they're having to deal with now, the complexity of this is the revelation that many of these partisans, many of the freedom fighters, were actually themselves very complicit in the killing of Jews during the Second World War. It's kind of well known that when the Germans invaded Lithuania, the Lithuanians were very willing participants in the execution of the Jews. Most Jews in Lithuania were murdered outside their towns and shot and buried in pits, and there was a huge amount of local complicity in terms of dealing with that. And so now Lithuania finds it in a position where it's got two different narratives going on, and how can it reconcile those two different narratives? The narrative of the strong, independent nation that has long fought for its rights is compromised by the understanding that these heroes weren't particularly necessarily heroic. In fact, in many cases, they were highly complicit in some of the worst events of the 20th century. And for them, they have this kind of I don't think they do have an existential crisis, because I think they kind of ward off the existential crisis because they don't particularly want to engage it. But there are people, I mean, I have to say, in terms of, there's a writer, Ruta Vanagaite, who's a Lithuanian writer who wrote a book called Mūsiškiai, Our People, which was very much opening up that debate. And in respect to the Lithuanians, the book was a bestseller in Lithuania. I have to say that following that, she made some statements about one of the Lithuanian freedom fighters, and her books were subsequently pulped, and she can no longer print in Lithuania, and she is basically persona non grata in Lithuania. So it's a hugely complex issue for the Lithuanians, which is kind of bubbling away beneath the surface, but it's very important in terms of who they conceive themselves to be. You know, this is the issue for England, is who do we conceive ourselves to be? Where do we conceive our place to be in the world? We rely upon our historical narratives to have a sense of who we are and our importance and why we are and why we fight for the things that we do fight for. But those stories can be equally complex, as people have said, and sometimes our heroes and our greatness can be compromised and can be problematic and can be downright wrong, and we have to deal with that crisis of what happens when our heroes are actually revealed to have some very dark sides to them.
And of course, Churchill being one example of that at the moment. Churchill, reconciling Churchill the imperialist with Churchill the freedom fighter. I wanted to ask another question about national boundaries. I think we're coming up to the Q&A, but we've been talking a lot about nations in this conversation. But of course, in a way, Lviv subverts the idea of the nation, because it has been, in the last century, it has been Austro-Hungary, it has been the Soviet Union, and it has been Ukraine. And of course, in Stephan Collishaw's The Song of the Stork, the story takes place in this sort of area that is Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, and maybe all of them and none of them. In a way, and that, of course, in some ways is speaking to a Jewish tradition of cosmopolitanism, where that makes a mockery of national boundaries. Is there a sense of sadness that these places are now locked into a much firm sort of sense of national boundaries, and can your work perhaps liberate them a little bit? Really?
It's sort of interesting. I've really admired the openness with which I've been received by most people, not absolutely everybody, but most people, including the mayor of Lviv, telling stories that are sometimes not putting so pleasant a spotlight on the activities of former citizens and residents of certain ethnicities in relation to things that happen, things that Stephan has evoked. But I think I mean, we are where we are. Where my thinking goes is really trying to imagine, I mean, having immersed myself for 10 years in the life of this city, first in East West Street, then in the Ratline, to imagine how people felt in the 20s and the 30s. They could not have imagined that a city that was of diverse ethnicities, in which people came from all sorts of backgrounds. They were troubled, sure, but basically they sort of got on in their own ways. There were hierarchies, and then it was just swept away in the space of 4 or 5 years, completely swept away, a consequence of greater powers, greater forces. And of course, it forces me to ask about the city that I love, London. You know, deeply diverse, what I celebrate about London, as Nottingham is, and what I love about the city. And I ask myself the question, could that happen in London? And I think the answer to the question is, why not? Actually, why not? We're seeing some of the forces that are currently at play, and we know that one thing leads to another, and that very soon you're in a logic that causes decisions to be taken, which leads inexorably to the next thing. Could the diversity of places like Nottingham and London disappear in 20 years? I don't think we can exclude that possibility. There's nothing natural about the state of diversity, nor is there anything natural about the state of our identity in terms of nationality. I mean, to be British, to be Scottish, to be Lithuanian, to be Ukrainian, these are totally artificial constructions that have been developed for essentially political and social reasons to bond us into a sense of identity with particular groups for all sorts of complex reasons. And all of this could disappear also in different ways. What is my identity? I am British and happily British. I have a British passport. But because my mum's French, I also have a French passport. And then in doing this research, I discover that my grandfather had a Polish passport, and I find the passport, and then the Polish government says, oh, if you want to be Polish, you can be Polish too. And then the Austrian government says, well, actually, because of your grandmother on that side, you could be Austrian too. And it's going to be the same with your kids, Stephan, with, you know, a mum from one place and you from another place. And all of a sudden, it raises the most fundamental question, who actually are we, and does it matter? And And you know, to be honest, yeah, I love being British and I love my British passport and I love Britain and I love British football and all these kinds of things and movies and culture and stuff. But actually, how do I identify myself? I think we're individuals. We happen to have these things, these labels stuck on us. They're artificial. There's nothing natural about them.
Stephan.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I have to say, one of the reasons why I love Vilnius and have loved Vilnius is its sense of it being a cosmopolitan and multicultural kind of place. As a city, it was a Russian city, it was a Polish city, it was very much a Jewish city. Something like 40% of the population of Vilnius prior to the Second World War were Jewish. You'd have heard more Yiddish walking down the street than you would have heard Polish, certainly would have heard Lithuanian prior to the Second World War in Vilnius. There's quite a bit of rivalry in Vilnius between the first city and the second city, Kaunas, which was the capital during the first bit of independence. And they've got very, very different feelings. And I've never liked Kaunas. Kaunas is very much chauvinistically Lithuanian. It's very much about the purity of Lithuanianness. And Vilnius never was. Vilnius always sits, whereas Kaunas is very much a Baltic city. Vilnius is much more an Eastern European city. You can still feel, you know, it's very close to the Belarusian border. You can still feel the Russian influence, and obviously the Jewish influence has sadly been wiped out from there. But you get that sense of the wonderful multicultural nature of that city. The great thing about what Eastern Europe really was, which was a wonderful mixture of hugely divergent sets of people. And I think one of the problems that we've had over the last 50 to 100 years is the actual fact that they're defining people along ethnic boundaries. And I think that's certainly one of the most worrying things about Eastern Europe, is the kind of the ethno-nationalist resurgence, where people like to see their nations in terms of their own ethnic purity. One of the things that really worries me about Lithuania is their talk about researching their DNA and their genes and how they're ethnically pure, and their conversations around the language and how ancient their language is, and the sense of this purity, which is again a lie. I mean, it's a complete fabrication. And, you know, we can fall into those same traps in England too. And I think we are pushing towards falling into those same traps in England too, is having some kind of false history that there is some sense of a pure English person. And it's a total construction. There is no such thing as a pure English person. And would one want one anyway? I don't know. I don't think one would. But I think, you know, I think Philippe's right that some of the things that have troubled Eastern Europe could very much trouble us here too.
I mean, you get it, frankly, if you bring it right up to the issues we're facing now. Why do we need to be told constantly that our system of track and trace in relation to coronavirus is the best in the world? Actually, it isn't. But what I care about is not whether it's best in the world or not, but whether it works, whether it does its job. That's really the only thing that matters. Whether it protects human beings, whether it protects citizens, whether it protects lives, whether it's 20th in the league or first, doesn't matter a toss. The only thing that matters is that it makes people's lives better. And that's all we should be caring about. And now we see, as Stephan effectively is saying, the way political discourse is skewed into a nationalism, even on something as basic as looking after our more elderly folk in care homes, looking after people who are at threat of exposure to coronavirus, when all we should be thinking about as a community is how can we come together to sort this out in the way that creates the least harm, not reinforcing our sense of national identity and our greatness and our bigness and our brilliance. And something is being lost in the way the debate is going. Something is happening in this country that is, I think, seriously problematic.
So thanks very much, Philippe, Stephan. I'm now going to open, there are already some questions in the Q&A box. A couple of them are quite similar to stuff we've covered already. So I'm going to start with a question, by the way, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. There's a question now from Ross Bradshaw from 5 Leaf Books. He's Mr. 5 Leaf Books, in fact. And he raises an issue that we actually haven't talked about yet, interestingly. He says, I was in Vilnius the night that Lithuania joined the EU in 2004 and attended a sub-Eurovision Song Contest style event in celebration. Incidentally, I would say that one of my favourite ever Eurovision songs is Lithuanian. Do anyone remember We Are the Winners by LT United? Okay, no one remembers that. So the question to both, since accession, do these countries now feel more European, or is it defined negatively against Russia? And we haven't really talked about Europeanness yet. So, Stephan.
I have to say that Lithuania, I mean, it's changed. It's from where it was in 1995, which was very much a very Soviet place, just very grimy and with very little infrastructure. It feels like a Western nation when you go to Lithuania now. And I have to say, because I often, when we had kids, we drove over to Lithuania, and it would be interesting on the drive there as the infrastructure gradually degraded as the closer you got and the further you got from France and Germany, and that's no longer the case. You know, it's now you wouldn't see the difference. In fact, it probably looks a lot smarter and a lot nicer in Lithuania now and parts of Poland than it does in England. Yeah, obviously, one of the great issues for Lithuania, I think it was an absolutely fantastic thing for Lithuania. Lithuania have always felt themselves to be a Western orientated nation, and I think they appreciate on the whole the Western oriented nation fact that they are in the EU. Obviously for them it was a double-edged sword, because what they did, I mean, obviously one of the narratives of the last 15 years, and particularly leading up to Brexit in England, has been the migrants coming into England. We have seen that as a problem. Of course, it's not a problem for England. One of the great ironies of this whole Brexit debate is that we have taken the best and the hardest working and the most qualified people from Eastern Europe and integrated them into our economy, and that has been incredibly beneficial for our economy. For Lithuania, on the other hand, it has been extremely problematic that they have a drain of all of their young people. They have a drain of some of their most intelligent people. The doctors have stopped, have moved into England, all the qualified people. And so it's been hugely problematic for Lithuania in terms of its population dropped almost 1 million. It didn't have a huge amount in the first place, only about 3,200,000, and now it's down to about 2,500. Very, very problematic for Lithuania in that sense.
Philippe, I've seen you give an impassioned defense of European identity at a dinner we both once attended. Is Europeanness still something that you were invested in, and how does that impact on a place like Ukraine differently in a way that it might in the UK?
Well, I think we all have multiple identities, and we can be British and French and European and a multitude of other things. It's not either or, to my way of thinking. I mean, Ukraine, as you know, has signed an association agreement with the European Union, and that has caused a tremendous conflict, even a war, actually, with the Russian Federation in eastern Ukraine. So this is a very, very big issue. Ukraine, people who are watching may not realize, is an absolutely massive country. I mean, it's just huge. It's basically 1,000 miles east to west. And the eastern part is more closely aligned with Russia, and the western part is more closely aligned with the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and with Western Europe. And Lviv is desperate to be part of the, quote, European, unquote, project rather than the Russian project. And I think that, the people that I see in Lviv are just mystified by what's happened in the United Kingdom, wish the United Kingdom well and success economically and culturally and socially and in all ways, but are very mystified because they don't quite see how Britain on its own can have the heft in terms of marketplace and economics and social and other things, and even militarily, outside of the European context. So they treat Brits as Europeans and are perplexed. And I'm asked a lot of questions about what is going on and why it's going on and what will it all lead to. But they do embrace the European project, and I embrace the European project, and I feel very European. And when I'm asked what I am, I say I'm European.
And Keith, also going back to your original point and just following on what Philippe was saying, in Lithuania, there's very much a definite sense that it is a dichotomy. It's either the European Union or to be swallowed by Russia. And their engagement with the European Union is very much, I think, based upon their desire not to be swallowed up again by Russia. And there is no doubt that Russia remains a threat on its eastern boundaries.
I mean, just to tie this in, most people are just completely unaware that it's a central plank of Russian foreign policy that the United Kingdom should leave the European Union. Russia wants to destroy the European Union. Point, period. That's the end of the matter. And so there's this incredible irony now with the news that we get that the Russians have been interfering and doing this, that, and the other. Actually, no. The most successful agent of President Putin is the British Prime Minister and the British Foreign Secretary. They are doing Russia's work for it. That is what Putin wants. And that's what is perplexing people, I suspect, in Lithuania, as in Lviv. They cannot understand why Britain is doing Russia's bidding in the context of the European Union. And this is not a question I am able to answer. I'm afraid I struggle with it too.
So we have a question from Kathleen Bell. I'd just like to say to Catherine Fowler and Mike McKigney, thank you for your questions, but I'm probably going to skip them for the moment because they cover some of the ground we discussed earlier. But Kathleen Bell asks, there seems to be a conflict between the celebration and recognition of identity and the dangers of national identity. This mirrors the difference in legal approaches to crimes against humanity and genocide outlined in East-West Street. Is there any way of resolving this, or could it be a productive tension? And I suppose actually, if you brought that out, that's probably a question for you as well, Stephan, is what are the dangers of recognizing a national identity? How do you live on the edge of that knife point, if you like? But Philippe first.
I mean, East-West Street explored the origins of these two concepts, crimes against humanity and genocide, which most people think have existed since time immemorial, but of course they haven't. They were invented in the summer of 1945, after the Second World War in Europe was concluded. And they were invented by these two characters who both came from the city of Lviv. You know, a couple of Polish Jews, one called Lauterpacht, one called Lemkin, and they had different ideas. Lauterpacht had the idea that in order to protect human beings against the state, every human being should be given individual rights. So the emphasis of crimes against humanity is the protection of our rights because we are individual human beings. Lemkin said, no, that's not how it works. People get harmed because they're members of a group. So if you want to protect individual human beings, the way to achieve that objective is to protect the groups of which they happen to be a member, and that protects the individual. So you've got these two conflicting approaches. And what I hadn't realized as I sort of stumbled into the story of East-West Street was that it goes to the heart of identity. Who am I? We might each ask ourselves. Am I mostly an individual, or am I mostly a person identified by one or more connections to a particular group? And that is a question that reasonable people will argue differently. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. But the next question is, how do we want the law to protect us? Do we want it to protect us because we are human beings, or do we want it to protect us because we are male, white, black, gay, trans, Nottingham Forest supporter, Arsenal supporter, whatever it might be? And these are really complex questions because they go to the heart of human identity. And I think what Stephan and I have been talking about, where we, through my non-fiction and his wonderful fiction and novels, is we're talking about the same thing. We're grappling with this most difficult of issues. Who are we?
Yeah, I'm not going to follow that up even.
No, I suppose the way I could put a twist on that for you is, you know, you have a company that is specifically set up to translate and market Lithuanian books in this country. So that is books that are defined by that one particular place. So how do you do that in ways that doesn't necessarily feed in to an idea of identity or a Lithuanian identity or any other identity that is exclusive?
Well, not something I'd thought about before I set it up, and I have to say it was, it's an idiosyncratic project. It was born about simply by the fact that there were literally, at the point in time when we created this, there was literally not a single living Lithuanian novelist translated into English. There was not a single novel. If I wanted to read a living Lithuanian novelist, it simply wasn't possible. There was none, and so it's in a way of kind of attempting to address that in my own quirky way that I decided to go about this project, not thinking through some of the complexities that it would actually throw up. And I did very much then come upon the issue of what do I mean by Lithuanian fiction? And of course, that is as incredibly problematic, despite the fact that it's a very small country, as it is to define what is English fiction. What defines the fiction of your country? And again, it brings us back to some of the huge problems we have in England. But just before I get onto the huge problem in England, in terms of the fact that very much after publishing some Lithuanian authors, Laučinis, I then went on to publish Gregory Kanovich. Now, Gregory Kanovich is he was born in Lithuania, born in a town called Jonava. He was Jewish. He writes in Russian, and he now lives in Tel Aviv. But he's a Lithuanian novelist. And so, what do we count as a Lithuanian novelist? And it's, that same issue is, what do we count as an English novelist? And again, one of the problems here is that, unfortunately, the very narrow definition that it tends to be white middle-class authors who we define as being English. And the restrictive voice that we tend to hear in fiction in England is incredibly restrictive. Why is a Pakistani writing in Punjabi in Bolton not English fiction? It's from somebody who's born in the country and exists in their version of the country. And in what sense is that not English?
That's, I think we'll have to leave that one as a rhetorical question for the moment. We have a question from Rebecca Spate saying, I remember being in Lviv in the mid-1990s and being so struck by the difference between how people behaved in public and in private, much more distinct. What are the cultural outcomes of this more secretive or way of living life? I suppose, I don't know whether that applies to Vilnius or somewhere as well, but Philippe.
Sure. Can I just say, I've just noticed on the Q&A a couple of questions from someone I've been in touch with from wonderful Nottingham, Malka Levine, who is from Lviv and who was in Lviv. I'm just saluting you, Malka, and I hope the folks from Nottingham will find a way to involve you in these conversations, because you lived through Lviv in the period that I wrote about in East West Street, and you now live in Nottingham, and you are British and you are English, just as I am, and just as Stephan is, and that is celebrated, and that is honoured, and it's very, very important to engage, I think, with those issues. I came across the secretness on my very first trip. East West Street begins in the prologue with a conversation that I had. I went to give a lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide. In a sense, this is a neat way to draw all the strings together, because the question takes us to that point. And after I'd given my lecture, a young woman came up to me. She was a student at the University Law School. And she just said to me, I was talking in the lecture about, the work I did, my grandfather and various other things. And she said, quite simply, your story touched me very personally. And I understood straight away that what she was saying is she was either Polish or Jewish, but that could not be spoken openly. That in the Lviv of 2010, as it then was in October of that year, was not something one wore on one's sleeve. One had an internal life of culture and identity. It was not something one shared. And I think, and Stephan, you may have observed this, I'd be curious to know actually, whether in answer to that question from Rebecca, there are in some of these places, and in Britain today, this phenomenon of the double existence or the treble existence, that you lead multiple lives. You've got your public life, and then you've got your private secretive identity. And I wonder whether that's also the same in Vilnius.
I think obviously one of the complicating factors, I'm sure this is the same in Ukraine as it is in Lithuania, in terms of the concepts of realities that they got used to embracing or not embracing in terms of their Soviet past, when they were used to the evident fabrication of histories, and the permeation of that through society, that there was an understanding that what was said was not necessarily true, but that you said it anyway, and how destructive that was to one's sense of self or one's sense of being. And that has not been necessarily helped in terms of the fact that the Soviet past has now become the dark period of Lithuania's history. Lithuania doesn't particularly deal with the Holocaust as the dark period of its history. It deals with the Soviet occupation as the dark period of its history. And therefore, the collaborators that are really vilified are those who collaborated with the Soviet Union. Now, the problem with that is that more or less everybody collaborated with the Soviet Union. You know, it was a norm to be involved in some way, shape, or form by becoming a pioneer, by joining the Communist Party in order to go to university, or and all those things. And so the sense in which you can openly talk about your own history with a sense of honesty, I think is probably very problematic in Eastern Europe still, both because of the history of what do we mean by the truth and what do we mean by the official narrative, but also in terms of that constant sense of judgment about your place in how you behaved and how you responded.
So thank you so much to everybody who's doing questions. I think we've probably only got time for one or maybe two, and so we're not going to be able to get to everybody. So thank you in particular to Malka, but you never know, we might be able to get to them. But there was a question, last question was from Will Mahwood. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Apologies for that. And he raises the point that both Vilnius and Lviv had minority populations of both Lithuanians and Ukrainians. And then he asks, how do you both think that this affects contemporary locals' attitudes to the city where they live and are now the majority? Is there a sense of suspicion in some way in not feeling properly Ukrainian / Lithuanian, or is it celebrated? I suppose we could broaden that out to thinking perhaps in the British context. There's often a sense that from certain parts of for example, the pro-Brexit party, the Brexit party, that London isn't proper Britain, because London is cosmopolitan, therefore not proper Britain. And also in America, the idea that the coastal, the west and east coast is not proper America, but the Midwest is proper America. Are those things that still resonate in places like Lviv, formerly cosmopolitan, international cities, or is it have things changed?
Well, I mean, in Lviv, I think most people just get on with their daily lives and don't ask themselves too many questions. But certainly when I visit it, and with certain members of the population, they have an understanding that the buildings they occupy right in that beautiful inner city centre, and I mean, if you've got a chance to go to Lviv, run, don't walk. It's just one of the most beautiful places. The food is fantastic. The hotels are wonderful. They're very good value. You should stay at the Hotel George. The coffee may be the best in the world. The food is brilliant. The beer is brilliant. But they're occupying in that space buildings built by others. Then, you know, it's fair to say that the Ruthenians, as they were known back in the first part of the 20th century, were the downtrodden. They were category 3. The Poles were at the top, the Jews were in the middle, and the Ruthenians were at the bottom. And, you know, you see that in the student records that I went through to write East-West Street, and in what happened in the Ratline when the arrival of Austrian Brigade Führer SS Otto Wächter suddenly downtrod the Poles, killed the Jews, and propelled the Ukrainians to the top. And so it creates this very complex situation in which in some sections of the Ukrainian population, Otto Wächter, in my view, mass murderer and war criminal, is celebrated. And indeed, I went, to visit the celebration of the Waffen-SS Ukraine Galicia division not so long ago, to see lots of people dancing around happily in Waffen-SS uniforms. That is pretty shocking. History is complicated. A Waffen-SS Brigade Führer gave the Ukrainians their national identity and their feeling good about themselves and propelled them from third in the league to top of the league. And that, in some elements of Ukrainian society, is to be celebrated. But I think equally there is a sense of who are we and how much of this was actually constructed by ourselves. And some of the monuments around are, of course, Polish monuments, not Ukrainian monuments. It's very, very complicated. You'll be familiar with this, Stephan.
Yes, and it's similar and different in a way in Lithuania. And I'd say in terms of Lithuanianness and in its sense of cosmopolitanism, the answer is both yes and no in terms of the question that Will posed. Will, by the way, runs a wonderful blog from Latvia. I will. Interestingly, the last time I was in Lithuania, I went into a coffee shop, and the guy in front of me was very obviously a middle-aged Russian guy, and he ordered his coffee in very stuttering Lithuanian, and it struck me because there was no way on earth that a Russian would have bothered to even try and speak Lithuanian 25 years ago in Vilnius. In fact, which is much more useful to speak Russian than it was to speak Lithuanian back in 1995. The fact that he felt that he had to speak Lithuanian, I think, speaks volumes about the changes that have happened in the country, where the sense of being Russian is no longer acceptable in some way, shape, or form. I wouldn't say, I'd say in many ways Lithuanians are incredibly tolerant and open, but there are aspects that they struggle with a sense of what it means to be Lithuanian, particularly in places like Vilnius that have complex histories. And so when it comes to Polish areas being allowed to put up Polish street signs, and that being enormously controversial, or not being allowed to spell Polish names with Polish diacritical marks, them having to use Lithuanian standard vocabulary only on their passports, there is still a real sense of a need to control the sense of ethnicity. And of course, in many ways, Lithuania is hugely less multicultural now than it was 50, 60 years ago. 50, 60 years ago, you'd have heard multiple languages being spoken by most people, and that's no longer the case. It's becoming more mono-ethnic now perhaps than it was ever before. It's history.
So, unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. Apologies to those I wasn't able to call on in the Q&A. One thing we didn't talk about that we could have talked about was language, the issue of language and how you navigate the multiple languages, Philippe, in your work, and Stephan, your relationship to Lithuanian as a language. And that leads me on to thank Elvira, our signer, who's had quite a tough job, particularly with Stephan. She asked in advance if he could spell out the name, so she was able to finger sign them. And as someone who doesn't speak British Sign Language, I think she's done a fantastic job. So thanks to Elvira, thanks to Stephan, thanks to Philippe, and now I'll hand back to Sandy.
Thank you so much, Philippe, Stephan, and Keith, for a fascinating discussion. I was nodding along with so much and reflecting on my own dual identity. I mean, I love British culture and European football, but I also love and own my Punjabi-ness too. But sometimes there's a real dichotomy and a tension there with my strange dual life of working in this enormously creative industry and feeling the pull of family back home in Derby and the Black Country. And it's a Punjabi community that is still entirely insulated by language, by ritual and superstition. And I'm also reflecting on the failure to teach empire and Britain's failure in facing up to and engaging with its own past. I'm the child of Indian immigrants, and I grew up hearing another version to Brexiteers' nostalgia. And this is how I think Britain's imperial mindset, fueled by ignorance of what actually happened during centuries of British Empire, has led to the chaos, the breakup, and self-delusion of Brexit. And so I'm thinking crucially, how as a community and a society do we repair and rebuild after the pandemic? And it's a conversation that I hope we can continue when events resume at Five Leaves Bookshop. So that's what I think. And I would love to hear what you think and your thoughts and feedback. So there's a link to the feedback form in the chat room. It will just take a few minutes of your time. If you could complete that, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you to Alvear for the sign language interpretation today, and to Pippa and Ross at Five Leaves Bookshop for their support and organisation, to Maura at Orion Books, and to Arts Council England for their funding, and to all of you for coming and for sharing your comments and questions with us. We're taking a break next week, but we will be back on Thursday, the 30th of July with S.J. Watson and Rachel Joyce. So save the date, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for joining. Take care and goodbye.